Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really wrestling with something huge, perhaps the most profound contradiction of the modern world.
Which is?
The persistence of conflict, of war, in an age where, theoretically at least, massive war is supposed to be becoming obsolete.
Ah, yes. It's the ultimate puzzle, isn't it? And we have, well, a monumental stack of material today. We're looking at everything from, ancient philosophy, Hobbes's pretty grim view of humanity.
Right, the state of war idea.
Exactly, all the way up to Immanuel Kant's very detailed blueprint for perpetual peace. And we're setting all that against the cold, hard numbers of modern quantitative conflict research.
So our mission in this deep dive, for you listening, is to try and synthesize this enormous scope. We need to tackle some really foundational questions. Is humanity actually evolving beyond major war, or are the deep drivers of conflict just, well, lying dormant?
And critically, what are the empirical mechanisms, the actual steps, you could say, on the ladder that reliably push a simple dispute, maybe a border argument, into a full-scale war?
We're hunting for those definitive nuggets of knowledge. We want to map both the philosophical dreams of peace and the statistical realities of war.
And we absolutely have to hold those two things in tension, don't we, throughout this whole conversation. On one side, you've got this powerful, intellectual, even moral drive towards peace, towards institutions.
The dream of perpetual peace.
Right. And on the other side, you have the sheer statistical weight of history. The data showing that certain geopolitical factors, again and again, just seem to produce violence.
Understanding that relationship between the dream and the data, that feels like the key to getting some real insight here.
I agree.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting right at the foundations. If we're searching for peace, we first need to agree on what peace even is. And the field dedicated to this, peace research, which really got going after World War II, it seems it split almost immediately over how to define its own subject.
That's exactly where we have to start. Peace research, as a formal field, it really found its footing right there at that intersection of peace activism, people who just fundamentally believed war must end.
A moral imperative.
Yes, and the rigorous application of, well, modern social science methods, trying to study conflict behavior scientifically.
Yeah.
But they hit this definitional problem almost straight away.
And the most traditional, maybe the most straightforward definition is what the sources are calling negative peace.
Correct. Negative peace. That's the original focus. And it's the easiest to grasp, really. It's about analyzing and preventing physical war, direct violence, things you can count,
Like casualties, battles, declarations of war.
Precisely. Under this definition, peace is simply the absence of that violence. If the guns are silent, if there's no active fighting, then you have achieved negative peace. It focuses the researcher on things like treaties, deterrence, arms control, military de-escalation.
Which seems like a solid, measurable place to begin. But then, the field, or at least parts of it, broadened its horizons quite dramatically. They introduced a concept that went way beyond just bullets and bombs.
That was the move towards positive peace. This was championed really famously by figures like Johann Galtung, and positive peace demanded a much, much more ambitious agenda. It wasn't just about the absence of war.
It was about the presence of something else.
Exactly, the presence of justice. Specifically, Galtung and others defined it as the reversal of what they termed structural violence.
Okay, structural violence.
Oh.
That sounds like academic jargon.
Yeah.
We need to break that down for the listener. What does that actually mean in practice?
Right. It's a key concept. Structural violence means the harm isn't caused by, say, a soldier with a gun, an identifiable attacker. Instead, the harm comes from the way society itself is organized, from the structures.
So the system itself is doing the violence.
In a way, yes. Think about avoidable deaths that happen because of deep built-in inequality, like high child mortality rates in one group because the economic system denies them access to basic food or health care that is available to others.
So it could be violence by neglect, or even by design if the system is set up unfairly.
Precisely. It's about social arrangements causing avoidable human suffering, shortening lifespans, things like that, even without any direct physical confrontation.
Wow, okay. That massively changes the scope, doesn't it? If you're studying positive peace, you're suddenly looking beyond military budgets and treaties. You're into global economics, equity, human rights, things that seem maybe a million miles away from traditional causes of war studies.
It did broaden the scope enormously. And, while this idea of positive peace was quite popular for, say, a decade or so, it started to face some pretty serious criticism, especially from the more quantitative research circles.
Why did they push back? If the ultimate goal is a more just and peaceful world, why did this focus on structural violence seem to, as the sources say, largely evaporate from the mainstream academic journals?
Well, I think it really came down to issues of pragmatism and measurability. Critics, particularly those involved with core journals like the Journal of Peace Research, the JPR, they argued the field had become maybe too focused on general social
Like
problems.
poverty, inequality.
Yeah, which are hugely important, obviously, but they argued it was distracting from the core mission of preventing actual physical conflict, the negative peace focus. The sheer breadth of positive peace made it incredibly difficult to isolate specific variables, to test hypotheses about war onset or prevention in a rigorous quantitative way.
So the field kind of retreated, back to focusing on stopping the shooting.
Largely, yes. Especially in the quantitative mainstream, it returned to analyzing and preventing negative peace, focusing on stopping measurable physical war and violence. You could see it as a retreat to the most immediate life and death problem, the one they felt they could actually measure and maybe influence more directly.
It sounds like a classic academic tension. Do you tackle the deep roots of conflict, which might be economic or social, or do you focus on stopping the violent symptoms, the wars themselves?
That's a great way to put it. And underpinning even that negative peace focus is that ancient question about human nature itself. We've got this foundational philosophical split going right back to the start of political thought.
Hobbes versus.
Well, Hobbes is the classic starting point for the pessimistic view, isn't he? Back in the 17th century, he gives us that brutal picture. The natural condition of humanity without a strong ruler is a state of war.
Of incessant war between individuals.
Right. Life outside society is nasty, brutish, and short. Left to our own devices, we fight.
He wasn't exactly an optimist about us.
Not at all. And this lines up with what some sources call the historical barbarian view, this idea that war is just the default setting, peace is the weird exception, and, might makes right.
But the whole reason peace research exists, the reason we're having this deep dive, is because many thinkers, Kant being the prime example later, completely rejected that view. They believe we could find institutional, maybe cultural paths out of that constant conflict.
Okay, so that philosophical tension really sets the stage perfectly for the next big question. Has something fundamentally changed, maybe in the last century or so, that makes major war between advanced countries no longer a realistic option? And here we have two really influential but competing arguments. Let's start with John Mueller and his idea about cultural evolution.
Mueller's argument is fascinating because he deliberately looks beyond just economics or international law. He argues that major war between the big, developed states, is becoming culturally obsolete.
Obsolete, like out of fashion. More than that, moving into the realm of the literally unthinkable. Not just unprofitable, though it might be that too, but actually sort of conceptually absurd. He argues this is a profound shift in our collective mental habits and our culture. And he compares it to how society got rid of two other massive, deeply entrenched institutions.
And those analogies he uses, dueling and slavery, they're really powerful for getting his point across. Let's take dueling first.
Right, dueling. For centuries in many parts of the world, if a man of a certain class felt his honor was insulted, fighting a duel was seen as a perfectly rational, socially acceptable, even necessary response. It was how you maintained your reputation.
It had rules, codes.
Absolutely. But over time, mainly through the 19th and early 20th centuries, this norm didn't just vanish because it was outlawed, although laws helped. It vanished primarily because society collectively decided it was ridiculous. It went from being seen as necessary to being seen as absurd, even comical, a fundamental cultural shift.
The practice itself just became unthinkable for most people.
Oh.
And Mueller says slavery, which was far older and more widespread, followed a similar cultural trajectory.
Exactly, but obviously on a much, much larger and more horrific scale. From the dawn of history right up until the late 1700s, slavery was just seen as normal, natural, economically necessary pretty much everywhere. Mueller really emphasizes that the abolitionist movement that gained momentum around 1788 wasn't some gradual culmination of centuries of thought.
It wasn't inevitable.
He argues it was something radically new, a relatively sudden, widespread moral and cultural awakening that reframed something utterly normal into something utterly abhorrent. Mueller's hypothesis is that major war is now following that same path of sociocultural evolution. It's becoming repulsive, ridiculous, unthinkable.
So the idea is war becomes unthinkable in the same way that shooting someone over an insult or owning another human being became morally or socially impossible for most societies.
Yeah.
This is where Mueller's cultural argument runs headlong into a very different explanation, championed by thinkers like Carl Kazin, focusing on economics.
Right. Kaysen actually agrees with Mueller's conclusion that major war is effectively obsolete between developed states. But he fundamentally disagrees on the mechanism. For Kaysen, the why is crucial.
It wasn't just a change of heart.
No. Kaysen argues war didn't just become unthinkable out of the blue. It became unthinkable because, first, it became profoundly unprofitable, both economically and politically, especially after the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so it became too expensive, too damaging to be a rational tool for states anymore. How did industrialization change the math so drastically?
Well, historically, you look at pre-modern societies, they were often structured precisely so that war could be profitable, at least for the victors. You could gain resources, demand tribute, capture slaves, seize productive land, control trade routes.
Spoils of war.
Exactly. But modern industrialized warfare completely flipped that calculation.
And the sources seem to pinpoint World War I as the moment everyone really saw this devastating new reality.
It was the horrific proof, wasn't it? The sheer scale of the slaughter in WWI, the grinding industrial destruction on all sides, the crippling economic costs. It led to what one source calls a bone-deep revulsion.
It wasn't just losing, it was the realization that modern war between industrial powers was almost inherently mutually destructive.
Precisely. The lesson hammered home was conflicts between major powers have to be negotiated out because fighting them out leads to ruin for everyone involved.
Let's focus on Kaysen's specific economic points.
Huh.
What are the costs that broke the old profit motive for war?
He points to three main things. First, modern war just obliterates vast amounts of tangible capital in the countries where fighting happens: factories, roads, railways, cities. Second, the loss of life is enormous, and crucially, it often hits the youngest, most productive cohorts hardest, crippling future economic growth.
The human capital loss.
Yes. And third, there's the immediate economic damage from diverting massive resources, labor, materials, scientific ingenuity away from productive civilian activities and into the purely destructive or resource-consuming business of war-making.
So the core idea, for a modern, developed, complex economy, conquest just doesn't pay for itself anymore. You might seize territory, but you're often inheriting a shattered infrastructure and a traumatized population. It's an administrative nightmare, not a prize.
That's Kaysen's point. He uses the example of, say, Germany annexing Alsace-Lorraine historically. Maybe there was a strategic or military benefit, but the economic gain from simply taking over developed territory in the modern era is complex, questionable, and very likely outweighed by the costs of occupation, integration, and rebuilding.
Modern economies are too interconnected, too fragile.
They resist simple conquest and resource extraction in a way older agricultural economies didn't. The level of destruction required to subdue a modern state basically ensures you destroy the very value you might have hoped to gain.
Now, Kaysen does mention one big exception that seems to challenge this: the United States in World War II. That doesn't fit.
That's a fascinating case because Kassain argues it actually proves the role. The U.S. entered WWII with huge amounts of slack in its economy because of the Great Depression. It was operating far below its potential capacity.
So it had room to grow.
Exactly. Because of that low starting point, the U.S. was pretty much unique among the major powers. It could massively ramp up war production and simultaneously increase civilian consumption and living standards. The war effort essentially pulled the entire economy out of depression into a massive growth spurt.
But for everyone else.
For basically every other developed nation involved, Britain, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, the economic costs were absolutely crippling, devastating. It confirms Kaysen's central point. For already industrialized nations running near capacity, the economic logic of major war fundamentally shifted and became overwhelmingly negative.
Okay, so we've got this big debate. Is major war obsolete because we've culturally evolved past it, like Mueller says? Or is it because it's just become ruinously expensive, as Kaysen argues? Now, let's pivot from theory to the hard data. If we look at the actual history, the statistics of state-on-state conflict, what does the evidence tell us is the single most reliable predictor of why wars actually start?
Right. When you dive into the big data sets, like the Correlates of War Project, which tracks conflicts over centuries, one factor just consistently leaps out above almost everything else: territorial disputes.
Land. It always comes back to land.
It really does, statistically speaking. Disputes over territory are so much more likely to lead to war, so much more dangerous, that many researchers view them as a fundamental underlying cause of war itself. It's the main friction point, the thing that most reliably lights the fuse.
Is there a key statistic that really hammers home just how significant this risk is?
There is, and it's pretty stark. It's sometimes called the 35x rule.
35 times?
Yes. The data shows that the probability of a war breaking out between two states that are contiguous, meaning they physically share a border, is 35 times higher than the probability of war between states that don't share a border.
Wow. 35 times the risk just from being neighbors? That's
Yeah.
huge. It immediately suggests that simple proximity is maybe the primary way conflict spreads.
It's a massive effect.
But does that still hold true today? In an age of missiles and cyber attacks, can't powers hurt each other just as easily from halfway around the world? Does a physical border still matter that much?
That's a really important question and a fair challenge. Long-range weapons obviously change the potential scope of conflict, but the data, historically, and even more recently, suggests that physical contiguity still generates those specific, unavoidable friction points.
Like what they...
Competition over border resources, maybe water rights, control of trade crossings, population movements, refugee flows. The kinds of day-to-day interactions and potential conflicts that are simply much less intense or non-existent between distant states. Sharing a border creates constant potential for disagreement.
And historically, looking back, territorial issues are involved in the vast majority of wars.
An overwhelming majority. Some studies put the figure at, 86% to 93% of interstate wars in various historical periods having a territorial dispute element involved.
And most wars, like actual shooting wars between countries, happen between neighbors. Or maybe a big power expanding next door.
That's right. Looking at the period from 1816 to 1980, for instance, out of 67 interstate wars, the vast majority were between neighbors, or involved a major state in overseas expansion, which often meant fighting neighbors of their colonies.
Which implies that if you can somehow definitively settle your borders with your neighbors, you've taken a massive step towards lasting peace with them.
A huge step. The research suggests that once two states amicably settle their claims over contiguous territory, a future war just between those two, what they call a dyadic war, becomes highly unlikely. The problem is, these disputes are incredibly difficult to actually resolve.
They get stuck. The sources call this the intractability problem. How hard is it, statistically, to settle a fight over land?
They are notoriously stubborn, they fester. The data is quite sobering. Only about half, 50% of territorial disputes get settled within the first 20 years.
Okay, so have drag on longer than 2 decades.
Yes, but here's the really striking part. In the next 20 years, only another 6% get settled.
Wow. So once a dispute hits that 20-year mark, the chance of resolving it just plummets.
It drops off a cliff statistically. They become deeply entrenched.
Why? What makes them so hard to compromise on? Is it just the material value, the oil under the ground, the farmland, the river access?
The material value definitely plays a role, but the research suggests it's often the symbolic value that really drives the intractability, especially over time.
Symbolic value? How so?
Well, as a dispute drags on, the state occupying or claiming the land starts to build deeper connections to it. Material links, yes, new roads, infrastructure, maybe resource extraction projects. But crucially, they also build symbolic links.
Like what? National myths, monuments.
Exactly. Temples, churches, national monuments get built. School textbooks tell stories about why this land is historically ours. The territory gets woven into the national identity, the national narrative.
So giving it up starts to feel like betraying the nation itself.
Precisely. It makes compromise seem like a national humiliation or a betrayal of history or ancestors. And this, in turn, strengthens the hand of domestic political actors, the hardliners, who build their careers on refusing to yield an inch on these highly symbolic issues.
That makes sense. It explains why politicians often find it impossible to just trade away a piece of land, even if an objective cost-benefit analysis might say it's not worth fighting over.
The symbolic weight becomes too heavy.
Now, this insight about territory links directly to that other big finding in peace research, the democratic peace. How does the avoidance of these territorial disputes fit into why established democracies rarely, if ever, fight each other?
It's absolutely a key factor. The absence of active, militarized, contiguous territorial disputes is a hallmark of the stable democratic peace zone. When you look at states that are both established democracies, scoring highly on scales like the Polity Index that measure political openness.
And they share a border.
Yes, when you look at contiguous democracies, you find virtually no territorial militarized interstate disputes or MIDES between them. Mides are disputes involving threats or displays of force, short of full war.
So they might still disagree about the border sometimes, but they don't threaten to shoot over it.
Exactly. The combination of shared democratic norms, higher levels of mutual trust, transparency, and established legal and negotiating frameworks means they overwhelmingly choose diplomacy and legal processes to settle border issues. They manage to keep the inherently conflict-prone issue of territory from escalating into violence.
Okay, so territory is like the fuel, the thing wars are most often thought about. But what's the ignition sequence? How does a dispute actually escalate into full-blown conflict? Our sources suggest it's rarely a single random spark. Instead, it's more like a syndrome of behavior.
That's a great way to frame it. The idea of an escalation syndrome. It suggests that certain common practices of international politics, what we often call power politics, systematically increase the risk of war.
Practice is often done in the name of preventing war, ironically, like building up defenses or making alliances.
Exactly. These actions, while maybe intended to enhance security, often function as steps towards war, rather than effective strategies for avoiding it. And the syndrome often begins with the development of a rivalry.
What defines a rivalry in this context, and why is that relationship statistically so dangerous?
A rivalry is usually defined as a prolonged, highly competitive relationship between two states. It's focused on a specific, deeply important issue, maybe territory, maybe ideology, maybe regional influence. And crucially, it's usually between two actors who are relatively equal in power.
Wait, equality is dangerous. I would have thought massive inequality would be more likely to lead to conflict, like a big power bullying a small one.
That can happen too, of course. But rivalry between equals creates a specific, dangerous dynamic. Relative equality often leads to interdependence. They can't ignore each other, but also to stalemate. Neither side can easily dominate the other or escape the competition.
So the issues just fester.
They become chronic, intractable, and the relationship becomes deeply hostile. And here's the key psychological shift. The actors often stop focusing on maximizing their own gains,
And start focusing on what?
on actively hurting the other side. They develop zero-sum perceptions where any gain for the rival is seen as a loss for them and vice versa. Success becomes defined not by achieving your own goals, but by thwarting or damaging your opponent. This poisons the relationship and fuels the rest of the escalation syndrome.
Okay, so rivalry sets the hostile stage. Once that's in place, states start adopting these behaviors that amplify risk. The first one often mentioned is forming alliances. Now, standard realist theory in international relations often argues alliances prevent war, right? By balancing power, creating deterrence.
That's the classic argument, yes. Alliances create a balance of power, making aggression too costly.
But does the actual historical data back that up? Do alliances generally lead to peace?
Well, generally, no. The empirical evidence is actually quite strong that alliances don't reliably prevent war. In fact, they're strongly associated with war, especially with the big, complex, system-wide wars that often emerge from rivalries.
How so?
If you look back historically, say before 1815, alliances were very often formed explicitly for offensive purposes, teaming up to attack someone else, and war frequently followed. Even defensive alliances have a mixed record.
And what happens when these alliances start to solidify the whole international system into two big opposing camps, like before World War I or World War II?
That's polarization, and it's the system-level danger. When alliance patterns lead to the global system becoming highly polarized, basically splitting into two rigid, hostile blocks, those alliances then serve to expand conflicts.
They act like transmission bells for war.
Exactly. A dispute that might have started between two smaller states within the rival blocs suddenly pulls in their major power allies, and then their allies' allies. It's a contagion mechanism that turns a dyadic two-state war into a complex, multi-state, potentially global conflict. That's a key part of how both world wars started.
Now, you mentioned earlier there's that one really fascinating modern exception, or maybe anomaly, the Cold War, where intense polarization between the U.S. and Soviet blocs seemed to actually prevent direct war between them.
That is the great and perhaps terrifying exception. The research does note that during the Cold War, the extremely high polarization, combined with the unique factor of mutual nuclear deterrence, actually seemed to decrease the likelihood of direct war between the superpowers of the U.S. and the USSR. The rigid bloc structure, paradoxically, might have provided some stability and predictability. And the nuclear standoff made the potential cost of escalation unimaginably high. Neither side could risk letting the power politics syndrome escalate uncontrollably into a direct confrontation. However, For the broader sweep of history, alliances remain a key ingredient in the escalation syndrome, mainly by increasing the scope and complexity of wars when they do break out.
Okay, so rivalry sets the stage. Alliances can expand the conflict. The next critical step in this syndrome is the material preparation, the arms race, or military buildups. Statistically, how strongly does investing heavily in military power predict going to war?
The association is incredibly strong, especially when it happens between established rivals. The danger isn't just that the weapons exist, although that's part of it. It's also the behavioral and political shifts that tend to accompany major military spending.
What specifically correlates with escalation?
One of the strongest findings is the link between a high defense burden, meaning the share of a country's total economic output, its GDP, that's dedicated to the military, and the likelihood that a dispute will escalate to war.
Let's get specific on that risk. What are the numbers here?
The jump is quite dramatic and, frankly, very concerning. Studies have found that the likelihood of a militarized dispute escalating all the way to actual war jumps from around 8% when states have a low defense burden, up to 50% when they have a high defense burden.
Wow, a more than six-fold increase in the risk of war, just based on how much a country is spending on its military relative to its economy. But why? Why would being better prepared for war actually make a state more likely to choose war? Doesn't preparation create deterrence?
You'd think so, but the evidence suggests it often reduces caution in a crisis. If a state feels well prepared militarily, its leaders might feel less restrained. They might be more willing to gamble, less likely to back down in bargaining, less fearful of the immediate consequences of fighting.
Whereas if you know you're unprepared,
Right. If you know you're unprepared and you face a crisis, you're probably much more aware of the immediate costs of defeat. You're more likely to be cautious, to compromise, maybe even accept a loss, rather than stumble into a conflict you know you might lose badly. So, ironically, adequate defense preparations can lower the perceived barrier to entry for war.
and this ties into what seems like a terrible domestic feedback loop in this whole escalation syndrome. To get the public and politicians to pay for these expensive military buildups, leaders have to sell the threat, right? They have to emphasize the danger.
Absolutely. Sustained military buildups are costly. They require high taxes or debt or cutting other programs. So to get the necessary domestic political buy-in, leaders almost inevitably have to exaggerate the external threat,
Frame it in stark terms.
often in transcendent, even existential terms. Our way of life is under attack. Our very survival is at stake. They have to paint the rival as deeply malevolent and dangerous.
Which then boxes them in later, makes it hard to de-escalate.
Exactly. Once you've spent years telling your public that the other side is an existential threat that must be confronted with strength, it becomes politically very, very difficult for those same leaders to suddenly pivot and pursue accommodation or compromise, even if the strategic situation changes.
Because the hardliners you empowered won't let you.
Precisely. This intense, hostile framing boosts the influence of domestic hardliners in the military, in politics, in the media, who benefit from the ongoing confrontation. The leaders become trapped by their own rhetoric and the political forces they unleashed. They've committed themselves and their political capital to the path of confrontation, making the final steps towards war much harder to avoid.
Okay, we've just mapped out the grim, data-driven path to war. Territory, rivalry, alliances, arms races, the escalation syndrome. Now let's swing back to the philosophical antidote. Let's talk about Immanuel Kant and his incredibly ambitious project for perpetual peace, which he laid out way back in 1795. Kant didn't see peace as just some vague hope or dream. He saw it as a reasoned, achievable political duty, and he thought it required very specific institutional changes.
That's right. Kant wasn't just wishing for peace, he provided a blueprint. He laid out 3 required definitive articles. Think of them as necessary conditions or institutional pillars that he believed had to be in place for perpetual peace to function properly. And they cover the internal structure of states, the structure of relations between states, and even the structure of interactions among peoples across borders.
Let's take them one by one. Article 1 concerns domestic politics. The civil constitution of every state should be Republican. Now, what exactly did Kant mean by Republican back then? It's not quite what we might think today.
Right, it's a specific meaning. For Kant, a Republican constitution primarily meant the separation of the executive and legislative powers. Crucially, the power to declare war should not rest solely with the executive, the ruler, the king, the president, but requires the consent of the legislature, representing the citizens.
Why was that separation so critical for peace, in his view?
It's a profoundly pragmatic check, not just a moral one. It connects directly back to that escalation syndrome and the costs of war we were just
Yeah.
discussing.
How so?
Kant reasoned that if the citizens themselves, the very people who have to do the fighting, pay the war taxes, suffer the losses and destruction, must give their consent through their representatives before a war can be declared, they will naturally be extremely
I
cautious.
have skin in the game.
Exactly. They will hesitate greatly before embarking on so perilous an enterprise. It forces the state to internalize the true costs of conflict in a way that an autocratic ruler who might see war as a sport or a path to glory without personal cost simply doesn't.
Okay, so a check on impulsive war making from within the state. Article 2 then moves to the international level. States must form a Pacific Federation or League. Why a federation? And why did he specifically argue against a single world government?
That's a really important distinction Kant makes. He explicitly rejected the idea of a world republic, a single coercive global government merging all nations. He thought states, in practice, would never agree to that.
Why not? Wouldn't that guarantee peace?
He thought they valued their individual sovereignty, what he somewhat cynically called their lawless freedom, too much. They'd resist being absorbed into a global superstate. So instead, he argued for something more achievable, a voluntary, non-coercive Pacific Union or a Fetus Pacificum, a league of nations.
A league that agrees not to fight each other.
Yes, a federation specifically designed to avert war among its members while preserving their individual sovereignty. It's meant to gradually expand, creating an ever larger zone of peace. And interestingly, this model looks quite similar to the kind of security communities or peaceful unions that we see liberal democratic states empirically forming in the real world today.
Like the European Union, perhaps, in its aims?
One could argue it shares some characteristics, yes. A structure maintaining state sovereignty but embedding it within strong rules against internal conflict.
Okay, and the third article deals with individuals crossing borders. Cosmopolitan tortides.
Right.
This one seems frequently misunderstood.
It absolutely is. People often read too much into it. Kant limits cosmopolitan right
Yeah.
very specifically to the conditions of universal hospitality.
Hospitality, like being nice to tourists.
Essentially, yes, but in a legal sense, it means the right of a stranger upon arriving on the territory of another state not to be treated with hostility simply because they are foreign. It ensures the basic physical possibility of interaction, of attempting to trade or communicate across borders peacefully.
But it's not a right to become a permanent resident or a citizen.
Kant is very clear on this. It does not grant a foreigner the right to be a guest indefinitely, let alone the right to demand settlement or citizenship. The host state can turn them away, provided doing so doesn't literally cause their destruction, like turning away a shipwreck survivor. It's a very minimal right, designed solely to facilitate peaceful global intercourse, not to mandate open borders or global citizenship in the modern sense.
What's really striking about Kant's whole project is that he wasn't relying on people suddenly becoming angels. He didn't assume some great moral transformation was needed first. He was quite cynical about human nature, wasn't he?
He was. He explicitly states that the problem of organizing a state or achieving peace is solvable even for a nation of devils, if they are intelligent. He recognized that our moral disposition is often lacking.
So, if not morality, how did he think this difficult progress towards perpetual peace would actually happen? What's the engine driving it?
He argued, quite ingeniously, that nature itself, meaning the observable patterns of human behavior and interaction, pushes us towards peace, even against our inclinations, driven largely by self-interest. And the mechanism he identified is his famous concept of unsociable sociability.
Okay, unsociable sociability.
That sounds like a contradiction. Let's unpack that.
It is a contradiction, and that's the point.
Yeah.
It captures the inherent tension in human nature. We are sociable, we need each other, we desire society, we can't flourish alone, but we're also profoundly unsociable. We're competitive, vain, driven by ambition and a desire to dominate others. We constantly rub each other the wrong way.
Like neighbors who need each other but also annoy each other constantly?
Sort of, but on a grander scale. Kant uses this wonderful analogy of trees in a forest.
Yes. He says trees need to stand near each other to grow tall, but in doing so, they compete fiercely for sun and air, forcing each other to grow straight and upwards to survive, rather than spreading out crookedly. Our unsociable nature, our competition, our discontent is what drives us to develop our talents, create culture, art, science, commerce. And ultimately, it's this same friction that makes living without rules unbearable and creates the indispensable need for a civil state to provide security.
So our own difficult nature forces us into political order.
Exactly. And he even argues that war itself, up to a certain point in cultural development, acts as an indispensable means for progress. It forces scattered, isolated groups to band together, form larger states, develop laws, and ultimately pushes humanity through sheer exhaustion and cost towards realizing the need for international peace. Our own antagonism paradoxically drives us towards the conditions necessary for peace.
That's a fascinatingly counterintuitive argument. And within this system, Kant provided a kind of ultimate ethical test for any political action, didn't he? The rule of publicity.
Yes, the transcendental formula of public right. This is his negative test for justice, derived from reason itself.
It's about whether you can say your reasons out loud, right?
Essentially, yes. Kant states that any political maxim, any guiding principle for an action that affects the rights of others, is unjust if that maxim cannot withstand publicity. If the only way your plan can succeed is by keeping your true intentions or your guiding principles secret.
Like if you have a secret plan to break a treaty you just signed?
Precisely. Or a secret policy of aggression. If making that maxim public would inevitably cause universal resistance and make the action impossible, then that necessary secrecy proves the maxim itself is fundamentally unjust and illegitimate. If you have to hide your real reasons, your action is wrong.
It's a powerful test. This whole Kantian framework really reinforces the idea we touched on earlier. Peace isn't just the absence of war, the absence of anarchy. It's something that has to be actively built.
It's the active creation of a functioning political system, both domestically and internationally. And the sources looking at history seem to confirm this. Periods of sustained peace, like the Concert of Europe after Napoleon, weren't just lucky breaks. They were characterized by a rich institutional context. Formal treaties, yes, but also informal rules, norms, regular consultations, practices designed to manage disputes peacefully.
And crucially, a certain mindset.
Yes. These peaceful periods often coincide with an absence of strong messianic or expansionist ideologies. There is a willingness among the major powers to tolerate differences, to manage competition, rather than trying to remake the world in their own image or eliminate rivals entirely. Peace requires structure, and it requires a degree of ideological restraint.
So we've looked at the causes of war, the risks of escalation, and Kant's ambitious framework for perpetual peace. But once a war does break out, we need to understand how it ends. Why do wars sometimes drag on for so long, seemingly defying logic, and what actually triggers their termination?
Wars persist fundamentally because the sides involved fail to develop similar or converging expectations about the likely outcome. They just can't agree on who is winning, who is losing, or what a final settlement should look like.
Even when the facts on the ground seem clear.
Even then, there's often what the research calls lags in the Bayesian updating process.
Okay, that's another one of those dense academic phrases. Let's translate Bayesian updating lag into plain English for the listener. What's happening politically?
It basically means leaders are slow learners when it comes to bad news from the battlefield. They're receiving costly new information every day, reports of casualties, lost equipment, economic strain, but they are systematically slow or resistant to updating their initial beliefs about their chances of winning.
They stick to the original plan.
No.
Overly optimistic.
Yes. They cling to the flawed initial assessment that victory is achievable or just around the corner. This psychological bias, may be driven by political pressures or cognitive dissonance, prevents them from cutting their losses and negotiating a settlement until the costs become absolutely overwhelming, either militarily or, crucially, domestically. They're slow to admit they were wrong, or that the initial gamble failed.
Now, standard bargaining models of war often assume that eventually the incumbent leaders, the ones who started the war, do learn. The costs mount, the reality sinks in, and they change their minds and seek peace. But the empirical evidence, looking at dozens of wars since World War II, suggests it often doesn't happen that way.
That's right. The data suggests a different, more abrupt, and more politically driven mechanism is often at play in war termination. Research analyzing, I think it was 78 different belligerent states across 27 interstate wars since WWII, found that wars often end significantly faster, not because the existing leaders finally changed their minds, but because there's a change in the domestic governing coalition of foreign policy elites. In simpler terms, the leadership itself changes.
So the people who started the war are often not the ones who end it. A new group has to come in.
That's what the evidence strongly suggests. When a new leadership coalition takes power, maybe through an election, a coup, or even just a major cabinet shuffle, they are often less invested in the original justifications for the war. They're politically freer to reassess the situation, revise the national expectations downwards, and initiate peace talks without the same loss of face.
This seems especially relevant in democracies, where a war-weary public can literally vote out the leadership that got them into the mess.
Exactly. Democratic accountability provides a mechanism for forcing that leadership change when the costs become too high for the public to bear. The presence of entrenched hardliners in the previous ruling coalition is often what prevented bargaining and prolonged the conflict in the first place. A new coalition can sideline those hardliners and make concessions the old guard couldn't or wouldn't.
This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. What happens after the fighting stops? How do states try to lock in the peace and prevent the next war?
Well, understanding how to avoid future global wars often involves looking closely at the periods immediately following major conflicts. You need to identify the rules, norms, and institutions established by the winning side, or more accurately, by the accommodationists, the political groups who tend to prevail after a costly war.
The ones who want to make sure it never happens again.
Right. These groups often try to create a new post-war order by designing rules and institutions specifically aimed at preventing a recurrence of the last war. It's often a backward-looking process.
Can you give some historical examples of that kind of institutional design trying to fix the previous war's causes?
Sure. You see it very clearly, for instance, in the U.S. Neutrality Acts passed in the 1930s. They were explicitly designed to prevent America from getting entangled in European conflicts, in the same way it was perceived to have been dragged into World War I by restricting loans, arms sales, and travel to belligerent nations.
Trying to legislate neutrality.
Yes. And perhaps even more dramatically, after World War II, both Japan's and Germany's new constitutions included provisions, Article 9 in Japan being the most famous, that severely restricted or arguably even prohibited offensive war-making capabilities and actions. They were institutionalized attempts by the post-war leadership, heavily influenced by the victors, of course, to fundamentally correct the perceived national errors that led to the catastrophic war they had just endured. They tried to build structures that would make a repeat impossible. Hashtag outrag outro.
Well, this deep dive has really taken us across the entire spectrum, hasn't it? From, Hobbes's grim view of human nature and Kant's hopeful but demanding blueprint for peace, all the way to the hard statistics of conflict. We've seen Mueller argue that maybe, just maybe, major war is becoming culturally obsolete for the big powers unthinkable, like dueling.
While Kazin powerfully insists, no, it's fundamentally about economics. It just became ruinously unprofitable.
And yet, despite those arguments for obsolescence, we cannot ignore the devastating empirical reality that the causal pathways to war, especially territorial disputes between neighbors, the dynamics of political rivalry, that whole escalation syndrome of alliances and arms races, those mechanisms remain incredibly potent.
That really is the central tension for you, the listener, to grapple with, I think. Major war between the wealthiest, most developed states might indeed seem irrational, maybe cost prohibitive now. But the statistical risk factors, the behavioral patterns that lead to conflict, they're still deeply embedded in the international system.
Especially for neighbors locked in those intractable fights over land or status.
Exactly. The road to war is still clearly marked by those signposts, rivalry, alliances, military buildups. And once a war starts, it often grinds on, fueled by leaders' resistance to admitting defeat until the leadership itself is forced to change.
So we end up circling back to Kant, perhaps. Given this stubborn empirical reality, what does it mean for his vision of perpetual peace? Is it just a pipe dream?
I don't think Kant saw it as a guaranteed destination, but as a continuous, practical duty, something we have to constantly work towards. He even suggested, quite pragmatically, that things like the commercial spirit and the sheer power of money often compel states to promote peace, even if their motives aren't purely moral.
Self-interest pushing us towards cooperation,
Yeah.
even if reluctantly.
Yes, that unsociable sociability again. The shift from the savage, lawless freedom of the state of nature to a cooperative state of nations, or at least a federation averting war, might be driven as much by the hard necessities of commerce and survival as by high ideals. Kant insists the goal isn't a chimera, not a fantasy, but a practical task we have a duty to pursue.
That feels like a powerful place to leave it. The true path to peace isn't just hoping war becomes unthinkable, but the constant active work of building systems, political, economic, legal, that make the preparations for war, that whole escalation syndrome, seem irrational and unnecessary.
And that remains the core challenge. If, as Kant suggested, the greatest evils afflicting civilized nations come from the constant arming for future wars, then the duty lies in constructing an international order where those preparations are simply no longer seen as a viable, rational, or necessary choice.